script and development consultant, and a whole host of other things. But mostly these days, yeah, I'm just an unserious junior art historical researcher, and I do a lot of silly stuff online.
Lovely, lovely. And for getting this off the road for a podcast, art history has always been something that a lot of viewers enjoy on this show. We had the privilege of having Rixandra on, and she was talking about the classical art period and the Renaissance, those two so separate ones. And we've had requests about the medieval period because a lot of people want to know more about it. So a first question I would have for you is, what initially drew you to the study of medieval art history in particular?
Well, God, for me personally, the entirety of everything that I've done subsequently academically, and I do quite a few bits and pieces. I'm trying to write a book on a couple of 20th century poets, and I've done this and that and the other, but it all started with art history, really. And I was brought up in a pretty solid tradition, which started from the classical antiquity and the reception of the classical tradition. And so often you see what we used to call the Dark Ages, where you'd have the fall of Rome in the 5th century, and then all of a sudden you'd be waiting for Michelangelo to pop up. And I was really interested in what happened in the intervening years, and I think it was that curiosity coupled with my faith as a Catholic that gave me this extraordinary interest into getting more into what went on in those basically nearly 1,000 years. It's an extraordinary period of time.
No, that's definitely interesting. I'm glad to hear that your faith is tied into it as well. A lot of our guests who are Catholic on our show tend to have that correlation as well. It's beautiful what the church could do for us. But another question I have for you on that is, could you give more of an overview of the main periods within the medieval art history? Because you did mention that there was the Dark Ages. Is there anything else in regards to that?
Yeah, so we have to remember that art history was an invention of Germans in the 19th century, basically. And people like Winkelmann and later Warburg decided basically to carve up and impose brackets and boundaries over periods and places of what was subsequently called art historical development, that had existed for basically this period of 1,000 years between them and it. And so from a pure fact space perspective, I have colleagues who also medieval art historians, but they focus on what used to be called the Dark Ages. So basically from the 5th century until the 8th or 9th century. And this is, prior to the Renaissance of the 12th century, which is really when the church basically sort of unites behind this idea that art is integral and essential for the defense of its ideas and its faith. And so there are various movements and moods and periods within it. But the more that you look at it, the more that you realize that actually it's the same as looking at what happened over the last 20 years. Can we say that there's a united movement of like millennial art history? Well, no, of course. Some people use YouTube, some people are on Twitch, some people building sculptures, and some people are building altars, right? So I sit in that continuum of people who recognize that I'm a medievalist because simply it's an arbitrary delineation of time, but I don't buy into this idea that there's a unique and consistent character as to what medieval art history is.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because I was actually going to ask you, funny enough, the next question is what are some of the key characteristics that define this period? And that's something I was wondering about. If it's not something that could be easily characterized as that, how else would you place it then?
So, it's really interesting. One of the first, I was really fortunate to have a very good, robust, old school education in art history. So we started with the Egyptians. And when you look at some of these, they're called Kouros, so some of the earliest sculptures like the Apollo Belvedere and these beautiful, perfectly proportioned statues that you see, which many of the gym bras will be using as their kind of, this is our perfect proportions type thing. They are themselves the development of ancient Egyptian ideas of sculpture, of beauty, of proportionality. But for the ancient Egyptians, the same amount of development takes place over a period of 500 years as it does in 50 years for the Greeks by the time that we're at like the 4th century, 5th century, 3rd century BC. So when we move into the medieval period properly, we're looking at a lot of things happening at once. Painting is in a pretty bad shape. We don't really have many examples of painting until we discovered Pompeii and Herculaneum. We've got a lot of people who are looking at the best bits of Rome and Greece and ancient empire and ancient civilization. We've got a lot of art that looks like people. We might call that naturalistic or mimetic art. We've got a lot of folk art going on as well. But first and foremost, for where I'm at, which is quite late, very nearly the beginning of the Renaissance, one of the overarching characteristics of medieval, middle, late, high medieval art history is basically a fascination with the world of signs and symbols and the way in which the world that we're looking at is full of trapdoors for us to understand, at least in the minds of the people who created this art, God, or the world around them. This isn't the same all the way through, but certainly that's towards, as you move towards like the 11th, 12th, 13th century, it becomes increasingly fascinated with also people looking like people again for the first time in almost like 300 or 400 years in some instances. But then also, what does it mean and how we're supposed to respond to it? What does it do in our society? And also, again, that's where the church comes in.
No, it's beautiful, and I'm glad you mentioned church, because I was wondering, a lot of people would characterize the medieval as having a very heavy hand, if you will, with religious influence that shaped the very essence of what that period was. And I find that very interesting in looking at that, where it almost, to me, and you could correct me on this, but art of an era reflects the morality or the principles or what's happening culturally of that time period. It is the thing that speaks the most. And I was curious to your thoughts on that. Would you agree, or would you say something else along the lines?
Well, I think, Sola, you bring up a brilliant point, because we have to remember as well that, for example, when you look at the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence or in Siena, and I know that I'm here in the UK and I'm surrounded by cathedrals which I consider to be under occupation because they're run by Anglicans, but you find these buildings which were built by father and son, grandson and grandfather for generations, and in some instances they were halted by the Black Death. It was the only thing that could stop them. And you find these extraordinary structures which are themselves, art and architectural history basically are indistinguishable from each other until quite recently. And you see that it takes a certain kind of culture to recognize the value in shepherding their children towards building this kind of thing. They're not going to make any money out of it. They're not going to be able to sell it for profit in the same way that if they became shoemakers, they'd be able to sell fine shoes. You see father and son building these great cathedrals, great monuments of stone out of otherwise like shanty, like rickety mud, brick, wooden houses. It takes a certain disposition of people. Who have a common understanding of the world that they want to be part of and what their physical built environment wants to look like. It takes a certain kind of person for them to recognize, yeah, this is what we're going to do. We're not going to make any money out of it, but this is what we're going to apprentice our children to doing. And the only thing that stopped that for a period of time across Europe was the Black Death. And when the Black Death receded, they just carried on doing what they were doing. So I think there's a lot in that. And compare that to the world of today, we have everything that we need to build these kinds of buildings again, but it's never going to happen because people don't want it, because people don't care.
That's the sad reality of the world we live in today, and I hope we could have a revelation where that could change sometime. But a question real quick I wanted to ask you. We keep touching on the Black Death, but this may seem silly, but for the audience at home who aren't familiar with the Black Death or the severity it caused, can you give a brief explanation of what that is?
You mean in its entirety?
Just a brief explanation for someone who, let's say, never heard of the Black Death.
Right. Yeah. So there are various plagues that were floating around in the Middle Ages, and of course we're pre-Semmelweis. We're pre-recognizing that if you've just touched a dead person, you should probably wash your hands before delivering a newborn baby, right? Common sense to us, but this was until the 18th or 19th, late 18th century. This was not normal. But the Black Death basically was so-called bubonic plague, literally the pandemic, which emerged in the middle of the 14th century, in something like 1346, and completely ran riot for just shy of 10 years, and was carried first and foremost by fleas on the back of rodents, and it brought Europe to a standstill. Something like 50 million people across Europe were killed in less than 10 years, and that's basically, I can't remember precisely how that would work out at, but it's something like around, probably close to something like 50% of the population of Europe was just completely obliterated in less than 10 years because of the bubonic plague.
And that's the severity of the plague as well. People aren't aware of. They hear the number 15 million and are like, well, that's pretty steep, but we have 8 billion people here. And you gotta tell them in the context there weren't 8 billion people back then in that sense. Neither was there the proper medical facilities to treat this stuff or take care of it immediately at a rate that would have prevented much further damage, which is unfortunate. And seeing that how it shaped Europe and brought it to, like you said, to a standstill.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's really useful that came up, and I was talking to Catholic Frequency and some of our other friends from X just recently, along with Diana and Brian Burgess, about this, and we were comparing statistics and basically working out which best multiplier to use to convert what happened in, let's say, the 15th century in terms of population levels for right now. And it's sobering when you think that there's something like 27,000 men and women were either killed or lost their livelihoods during the English Reformation when King Henry VIII broke from Rome. That's the equivalent of 2.5 or 6 million people today who were either killed, lost their livelihoods, lost their jobs, were completely disenfranchised. That's more than the number of people who tried to get from wherever they are in the world into either Britain, Europe, or America during current political crisis at the moment. These are huge numbers.
No, definitely. And going back to what we were talking about earlier in regards to religious influence, we were touching on the cathedrals and the monasteries. Do you believe there was also a deeper, almost symbolic and underlying role of why these were so important for that society during that time period?
Well, yes, obviously, for a million and one reasons. One of the first things that happens after the fall of Rome is the emergence of the rule of St. Benedict, the governing. We might actually say that every subsequent political constitutional document ever in history owes everything to the rule of St. Benedict. When the law and order of the Roman Empire collapsed, when Rome fell to the Goths and Rome fell to the barbarians, the church was the first person who provided an answer, and the rule of St. Benedict provides answers about everything from crop rotation, about how to respond to people that you don't like, how to receive people into your home, about how to have order amongst yourselves, how to receive people who need support, about how to deal with common money. You look at everything that, from this period in time, you have two sides of this, right, Sola? You have the physical churches, monasteries, cathedrals, and then you also have the intellectual powerhouse who ordered them to be built. And sometimes we can focus on the physical structures. Quite rightly, they're extraordinary, especially in the world of today. But behind them is the medieval mind of the church, and the medieval mind of the church is that which is attempting to provide order, freedom, liberty, guarantees of personal opportunity, and all of these kinds of things. And it literally starts as soon as Rome falls. literally less than 50 years later, the rule of St. Benedict takes hold, and the rule of St. Benedict puts the church in a situation where it is the seat of freedom, it is the seat of liberty, it is the seat of learning, and that only grows over the next 700 years or so.
That's beautiful to hear about. God bless our church. And and something I was curious about when we were discussing this, but I noticed when studying for this episode and getting research in that a lot of the heavy hitter artists of this time were Italian. And I was curious if that's just a coincidence or if there was a bigger hand to play there. Did the church show favor among a lot of those artists, or was it just good luck of the draw? I'm curious to why, for the medieval era, so many foundational artists that defined the era were Italian.
Well, this is this is where I hop on your tinfoil hats, because this is where we're about to go Joe Rogan here. But the idea of the artist as a celebrity, the idea of to think even of Michelangelo, for example, that just didn't exist in the 12th century. It didn't exist in the same way. One of the first works of art in the Middle Ages, where it's signed by an artist, is a portal over a doorway in Artà in France at the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare, and it is signed Giselbertus. It's one of the first instances where, in the Middle Ages, where an artist intentionally takes ownership of the work that he's done, because we have this opinion that for a long time they were drawing, when art really sort of was rebooted. Well, we're in a weird. Listeners, please, enlightened listeners, please be forgiving in the way that I'm trying to negotiate some of these bits here. But in the 12th century, we're in this weird overlapping period where all of a sudden the idea of the artist as a celebrity, the possibility of that, comes to the fore. In terms of location and place, when we're in the 12th century, art was not really celebrated in the same way that it would go on to be subsequently. All I would say, as being as succinct as I can, is that Michelangelo and the Florentine Renaissance, Giotto, on whom I've written a great deal, he was informed by both Byzantine, Eastern Orthodox, Greek painters. He was also influenced by Greek silversmithing and gold and silver jewelry making. We can't always see these things conspicuously because a lot of the main things that were influential were portable objects at this point in time. So, but yes, certainly there is a lot of factionalism in early, in like high medieval art history. And you can see, for example, that when you read Vasari's Lives of the Painters, which is like the Bible of medieval and early Renaissance painters, you can find that if somebody's not from Florence, they'll get a really bad biography written about them. And if they're from Flanders or from France, they'll get an even worse one, right? So there's a lot of factionalism, but we're now in an interesting place at the moment where we're trying to basically just look at those things for what they are and what they mean. And there is the other thing that's just worth mentioning really super quickly is that Rome in the 12th century was basically a field of sheep. It was not, Rome was a suburb of the Vatican at this point in time, not the other way around. So there's a whole lot of history to wade through into why people were regionally in favor of this or regionally in favor of the other.
Yeah, and it's interesting, although there was a dominant amount of Italian artists, there were exceptions, such as the Dutch sculptor Klaus Slutler, I believe is how you say the person's name. Correct me on that if I'm wrong. He was a Dutch one, and he's known for works such as The Well of Moses, which is a really beautiful piece. And there's another one, Hildegard of Bingen, who's a German one. And one that really interests me, though, that really stood out from the waves of the Italian artists, if you will, is Theophanes the Greek. And I looked into this, I'm like, oh, this is a Byzantine painter who was working in what is today Russia and greatly influenced what is Russian iconography and paintings and traditions today. And I found that very fascinating that the tradition came around during that time for the very noticeable now, like Byzantine aesthetic artwork, which I found fascinating.
Well, what you see in particular, and this is where I come alive on this point. So, the beginning of the Florentine Renaissance actually has a couple of two major unexpected influences. One of them is Byzantine, i.e., Greek or Russian, and the other is French, which for me as an Englishman is very difficult for me to say. Excuse me, while I just spit into a bowl and bless myself 3 times with holy water and garlic around my house, because you know that we have some feelings about the French. But you can see, for example, that Cimabue, and you find him in, even Dante makes reference to Cimabue in La Divina Commedia. I think it's in the Purgatorio actually, when Cimabue is made reference to. But Cimabue was the mentor of Giotto, and Giotto built the Campanile, the bell tower next to the Duomo, the cathedral in Florence. And Giotto is the first person who, in the Florentine artistic scene, creates realistic, empirical proportion perspective. He is the first person who makes various people in a painting look as though they have distance, as though they're in 3 dimensions, so they're not either stacked on top of each other or crushed behind each other. But the story goes that Cimabue, according to Vasari, that Cimabue was a young man, a young peasant boy who was drawing sheep in outside of in the middle of nowhere in the Tuscan hills. And some traveling Greek painters, craftsmen, saw his talent because he was drawing a sheep, and he drew it so well that they went to his parents and apprenticed him. And this is one of the reasons why, when you look at these extraordinary panel paintings of Jesus Christ on the cross, that they look almost identical in manner, in facial expression, to Russian or Greek icons, because the earliest influence of the renewal of Christian, of Catholic art prior to the Renaissance came from a couple of places. I won't get into the France thing, but it basically was spearheaded by what we call like the Italo-Byzantine style, the influence of these traveling tradesmen from the East, as we call it, on these basically, talented but otherwise uneducated, untrained artists who had a lot of potential but didn't know what to do with it. So that's where it's a melting pot, really.
And I'm going to ask you a bit of a weird question now, but bear with me. So let's say we close our eyes right now and think of this period of art. What are key words that you would describe to someone if you tell them to close their eyes and visualize this in their head? Is there certain moods in the strokes of the brush? Is there certain things with the environment, the setting, the contour? I'm curious what paints this picture for you, if you will, if you could describe this and bring it to life for someone.
Well, if we're talking about the 12th and 13th centuries, if we're talking about between the 12th and the 14th centuries, as funny as it sounds, the word I would use is plastic, because this is the period of time when all of a sudden these artists are taking an interest in portraying the human person again, like the human body, and they're interested in, especially painters, become envious of sculptors. They become envious of the talent and kind of the excitement that sculptors can create through working with stone to make things look three-dimensional. And they're interested in creating the same plasticity in their paintings. And this is where, for me, Giotto, but sorry for your 2 words, this is so difficult. My 2 words are plastic and also...
I wouldn't have to worry about 2 words. It's just if I was to close my eyes, like what are some of the key words that you would describe to someone explaining this? Like some of the key things I should be visualizing in my head if I had my eyes closed thinking about this?
I would say plastic, lifelike, human. There was a huge period of time when, and you know what I'm talking about, when you look at the old tapestries and you see that a human body has the same proportions as a pin or a knitting needle, and they're so thin and long and all, you know, streaked out. By the time that we get to Giotto, they're interested again in portraying interested in making the human body look like the human body. And that's also relevant to our time as well, because we shouldn't be ashamed that we have bodies, and they're worthy of being represented properly. And I think that we have so much in common with the 13th century painters in this respect.
And you say we shouldn't be ashamed of our bodies in art, and I agree with that. But would you say it would be more of an homage or similar to the Romanesque art, where a lot of it was, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but nude models, people who were very exposed? Was it more modest in its approach, or was it still something to be embracive and proud about in its style?
Well, so the Romanesque is one of these terms that we've inherited, and it's not a bad one, but again, it's another invention of the 19th century. We see, for example, this is where the classical context is worthy of attention, because the nude male form at the time of Aristotle and at the time of Plato, you would never see a nude female body. You would never. There is the male equivalent of a kouros, of kouroi. They're called kourei, but you'd never see a nude female body, because it just wasn't conceivable. It wasn't thinkable. And when we reach the 12th and 13th centuries, all of a sudden there is this re-emergence of thinking about dignity, propriety, modesty. Not that it's been absent in the intervening period of time, but yes, compared to what will follow after, everything is very respectful. With one exception, there is one saint. There are only two major religious figures who were ever depicted nude or very nearly nude in the High Middle Ages. One of them is Christ and the other is Saint Sebastian. But apart from that, all of them diligently pious, sensible. And that also, especially when you're looking at sculptors and then later painters, gives them the most extraordinary opportunity to show their technical prowess, because clothes are really difficult to draw. Like you can be a halfway decent painter or sculptor and you can make a body look like a body, but it's even harder to make clothes on a body look like clothes on a body. So let's also be mindful of the fact that this wasn't entirely due to like pious thinking about, you know, modesty or anything like this. There was also a technical benefit to having bodies covered up as well. But yeah, the Romanesque thing is interesting, especially in the Italian context, because there are so many influences competing at the same time, especially by the time that you get to the end of the 12th century, that you have the Romanesque and then also the Italo-Byzantine all competing in terms of their formal qualities. But one of the things that they have in common is that they're not for porn, basically.
And that's actually a very interesting thing you brought up, because it's an ongoing philosophical argument I have with some of my friends, where I asked the question, where do you draw the line from this is art to this is pornographic? And to put some context in here, what I mean by this is, let's say you could see something like, I don't know, a Playboy magazine, if you will, where you know this is clearly pornographic, lewd material. This isn't art. It's, you know, seductive. It's not good for you. While you could look at, for an example, I know, especially in the 1970s, the name is escaping me right now, but there was Dutch photographer artist who did phenomenal silhouette pictures of the human body. And he has a very famous photo that he took of like a black and white silhouette of a naked woman who was draped and covered with a very thin like cloth. To me, my first thought when I see this photo, because it's very eye-catching, is not, wow, you know, lustful thoughts here, lustful thoughts there, she's so lewd or anything like that, nothing weird. It's more like, wow, that is a stunning woman and has the beautiful anatomy of her body. You see the curves and the shapes captured with the black and white contrast. And I'm curious, your personal opinion, where would you say we can draw that line with this is art and this is porn? Do you believe it's only in drawings, or do you think even photographs as well is similar? I'm curious your thoughts.
So it's interesting. Photographs and photography and film have never really, well, unless you're at some like third tier state, you like Harvard or something like this. Like photography has never entered into serious art historical discussion. Not
My apologies
because,
for that, man.
not because, and just to give context on that, you can just look at it from aesthetic perspectives. A camera is capable of creating something that looks like a painting, but it has not been created. It has been recorded. So it exists in a very different context. So photography is something that I personally, as an old trad, like Florentine, Viennese trained artist, I find it very difficult to talk about. I think one of the examples that I use to kind of highlight the difficulty of the point that you raised, Sola, is, if you look around most beautiful churches in Italy, you will find pictures of naked babies. And if anybody produced those images today, whoever made them would be arrested, right? It's something that grounds our understanding of contemporary artistic context. I think that unfortunately, I don't think that there is anything. I don't want to get too philosophical or aesthetic here, but I think that it's possible to record an image of a nude body that is obviously not pornographic, and I think that it, unfortunately, for me as somebody who believes in objective standards of beauty, it puts me in a difficult position sometimes in saying that we should be depicting this, we shouldn't be depicting this, but at the same time I recognize that the nude form is beautiful. It is not necessarily inherently pornographic, but I suppose the lion's share of that is a question for another time. Although I do have one example, again, from not the Middle Ages, but just after the early modern period. You see, for example, this other saint that I mentioned, Saint Sebastian. One of the reasons why he's become this quote-unquote queer saint icon or whatever is precisely because he was, in his iconography, because he was shot to death semi-naked. I mean, originally his origins in Tuscany are being as a plague saint, but by the time, like 300 years later, by the time that you reach Bronzino depicts in something like 1533 one of the apprentices in his studio, basically semi-naked, with an arrow in his side. Like gesturing, with an arrow in his hand, making lewd gestures. This is supposedly the image of a saint, but in reality, you can tell that it is, one might say, bearing the hallmarks of something that is slightly pornographic, at least for the person who made it, if not for the person who's viewing it. So it's a difficult question.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I'm in the camp that beauty is objective, not subjective, and if it were so easy to just do to cop out beauty's in the eyes of the beholder, I would, but I'm not doing that because I don't believe that. I think that's false, but it makes sense of what you're saying, and to remove the photographic element of that, because that's something you correct, my apologies, not considering, would you be interested to characterize, if you will, and then we can move to a different subject on this, but let's say people sketching a nude model, if you will, because I know some art schools do that, where they'll hire a nude model where people would just sketch the physical body. Would you still say that's considered to be art, or how would you approach that one?
Well, so there are two. I have two answers to this, but both of them basically meet. The tracks meet on this one. So when I was studying art history in Florence, just down the road from where I live, there was one of the last old school ateliers, basically old school drawing studios, run by Charles Cecil, the Charles Cecil Studios, and he was a student of Gamel, and Gamel was a student of John Singer Sargent. And if people are not familiar with that, he was one of the most prolific portrait painters of the 20th century. And basically the Charles Cecil Studio still works on this basis that, first of all, you draw from the antique, you draw old sculptures, you draw old pottery, you go to museums and you draw what you can see, and then when you've mastered that, then you eventually work your way up to drawing from life. And I don't think that there is anything remotely pornographic about tasteful realistic depiction of the human body. It's the same thing. So I think we've had this conversation elsewhere as well. You can compare this discussion about tasteful nudes, and I say that in not the Snapchat, TikTok generation tense sense of tasteful nudes. I mean, there is such a thing as, you see nude bodies throughout the ancient world. You see nude bodies throughout the medieval world. It only goes wrong when all of a sudden the world's understanding of the body goes wrong. And you can see this every day when you look at breastfeeding. People get embarrassed when they see a young mother breastfeeding because they're embarrassed about breasts. But there's nothing wrong with the function of breasts doing what they're supposed to do, mothers doing what they're supposed to do. So the way that I look at it is that, unfortunately, the modern consciousness has ruined it for everybody, because when we think of bodies as being innately for use and for our own personal sexual profit, then we can't look at the body as if it's anything else. So, of course, 110%, I've friends who've become extraordinarily successful portrait painters, starting from pottery and then going on to nudes, and like nude human persons. There's nothing pornographic about it. But unfortunately, the porn agenda has ruined it for everybody, because apparently all of our bodies are innately like flesh pots for everybody's delight.
I understand what you're saying, that there's this aura of professionalism amongst, so same as why you wouldn't, an example, accuse a doctor who is doing a checkup on a patient, to be getting aroused, if you will, like doing anything weird with their patient. It's just simply a professional atmosphere. Like, you're there for a reason. But I like how you said that, though, with the pornography. It's ruined a lot of things, because there is a pope that is escaping my mind right now who commented on pornography, and he has a quote where he says, "The issue with pornography is not that it shows too much, but it shows too little." And a lot of people were confused on what he meant by that. And to me, I took that as like exactly what you said, where we're in such a consumer-based society that just objectifies and uses our body, and it reduces it to nothing but like you said, flesh bags, which is very heartbreaking for the world that we live in currently right now.
Yeah, if I recall to the best of my ability, I think it's Pope St. John Paul II who does say exactly that. The problem with porn is that it does not show too much. It is, in fact, that it shows
Too little.
Little, yeah, if I recall.
I believe it's JP too. I agree. So, one more thing I want to ask you. This is a bit of a topic change, but we discussed a lot of like the original like elements, if you will, of this period of art, where you said it's like almost plastic, human-like. But I was curious, is there anything that was significant or different or unique in the material being used by these medieval artists? Did they have their own unique technique to it, or their own like ways of going about it that's different from other periods?
Well, I think that as we see the beginnings of what would then go on to become called the Academy, and we were talking about people like Poussin and the full-throated academic tradition in art that comes like after the 16th century, there are a whole host of technical innovations, like in Cellini's Handbook of the Artists. For the first time, there are extraordinary textbooks which apprentices are given about how to make glue out of goats' hooves or animal bits, and how to mix paints together from components which are now considered to be toxic and things like this. What we do know is that from a technical perspective, that there is the beginning of discussion. People are sharing notes. Let's say the world has gone dark from the 5th century. This is an overstatement, but by the time that we get to the late 12th, people are sharing notes in terms of saying, this powder makes this pigment, this color white, better than this one does. People are sharing and exchanging notes on how best to bring about their, to get the best out of their work. The thing that comes towards the end of the period that I focus on in particular is, especially when you think of somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, on whom I am not an expert at all, but Leonardo da Vinci is one of the first people who really takes Giotto's legacy and runs with it in terms of anatomical authenticity, to the extent where Leonardo da Vinci would examine corpses and dissect corpses because he wanted every aspect of the way that he portrayed muscle and sinew to be 100% authentic. He was not just interested in making the human body a totem for some artistic or intellectual ideal. He wanted to portray it in the same way that we would look at a photograph saying, does that capture everything? So this is not in place in exactly the same way, but even in somebody like Giotto, when he painted the Santa Maria Novella crucifixion, which is regarded as one of the first major images of Christ dying, the Christus Patiens, Christ dying and suffering on the cross, he paid attention to what happened to the human body when it died. He went to morgues and looked at bloated corpses, the stomach sagging, rigor mortis. So there is a main technical innovation in not just looking at things being nice and pretty and beautiful and that, in a kind of like, oh, if it's got a head and two legs and two arms, then it's a human person. There is a technical development in that all of a sudden real bodies, a new revived understanding of mimesis or mimetic depictions of the human person becomes a thing. And aside that, as I've said, techniques, perspective, proportion, all of these things are being shared, especially in Florence, in Tuscany, in Siena, and elsewhere to differing degrees as well. But yeah, a lot going on in a very short space of time.
That's really beautiful that you're able to get all of that. I'm really impressed. It's amazing to have you on, and really want to thank you again for being on the show. But really quick for our guest, we're going to be going into our break now, and we will be back shortly. Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to Requiem Radio. Black Monk Rosaries. Black Monk Rosaries are truly something that stand the test of time. They honor the tradition of Saint Dominic by using only the finest materials and craftsmanships. Black Monk Rosaries, bracelets, medals, chains, and keychains come with a lifetime warranty to it. If anything breaks, they'll replace it, no questions asked. Crafted from high-impact acrylic beads, corrosion-resistant stainless steels, and industrial-grade paracord, Black Monk Rosaries are built to be the strongest in the world. Each piece is handmade with attention to detail and inspected 3 times to ensure top quality. Experience the durability and elegance of Black Monk Rosaries, strong enough to be worn proudly in your faith. Visit Black Monk Rosaries today. Hi everyone, we're now back from our break, and we've covered a lot of ground so far. First, we're talking about what initially drew our guest here to medieval art, following by the religious influence that shaped it and some of the heavy players involved in it. We also briefly touched on some of the Byzantine influence of said art, and now we're going to be moving into more of a question that intrigued me during our break. And what I would like to ask is, we mentioned earlier how there was Romanesque art, but I'd like to know and ask Will this question. So what is the major distinction here between Romanesque and Gothic art?
So partially geographical and also partially stylistic, and to a certain extent the two, let us say, for example, the best way to answer this question is by looking at architecture. So for example, here in the British Isles, we have one famous cathedral that is part Romanesque and part Gothic, and that is Durham Cathedral. Although in the British Isles we don't call it, it's not called Romanesque in the British Isles, it's called Norman. Essentially still of French origin, so like of the Romance. And you find that you can see an exact point where the builders moved from building in the Romanesque style into the Gothic. It's less clear in painting and in, I suppose, what was later called the arte minori. But you find huge, solemn, sturdy columns, barrel arches, which are just semicircular, compared to the Gothic, which are, everybody knows what the Gothic arch looks like. It looks more like a whalebone. And you can see quite literally in Durham Cathedral, as one example, you can see exactly the point where they moved from working in the Romanesque or Norman style into the Gothic style. The barrel vaults, or the vaulting, or the arches stop being perfectly semicircular, and they become long and slender and pointed and look more like whalebones. How does it work in sculptural or decorative elements? So Romanesque art is still, and just for dates here, so we would broadly say that Romanesque art it flourishes from, let's say, from the beginning of the 11th century through only about 150 years through to about 1150, something like this. But in Romanesque art, it's still often very deeply symbolic, not quite so naturalistic, highly stylized. Themes and presentations and images, the way that the entire subject is approached in Romanesque art tends to be very didactic, which is to say that you're looking at an object, or you're looking at an image primarily so that you can understand some deeper secondary meaning, some intellectual or religious or spiritual meaning. You can find a great example of this in St. Bernard of Clairvault's descriptions of Cluniac art in his Apologia, which I won't get into here, but that's a good place if anybody's interested. You can read St. Bernard of Clairvault's Apologia, beginning of Cistercian art, which is a subset of Gothic art, specifically because it's too mystical, it's too allegorical, it's too symbolic, it's too this, it's too that, it's too the other. Whereas you find in the advent of Gothic art, subsequently, richer color palettes, more naturalistic figures, a desire to use what would eventually become in the Florentine Renaissance referred to as empirical, or latterly Latin, more like subsequently scientific perspective. And you can see this, the picture is more clear in architecture than it is in art. It's a very complicated question, because it isn't as though one thing stops and another starts, because you can see very fine Gothic paintings, you can find very fine examples of Gothic sculpture and statuary, which is still highly influenced by Romanesque ideals and aesthetics in terms of the proportion of the human person. So it's a very, very complex, because these things are going on at the same time to a certain extent, and there's an aspect of taste making and what people prefer, rather than some person sitting down and saying, this is the art of today, right? Look at it this way. You put out you say, we need to put a flyer out on the church cookout or something. Somebody uses Comic Sans, somebody uses Calibri, somebody uses Times New Roman. They're all people in exactly the same time period and context. They've all got their own aesthetic predilections as to what looks good and what doesn't. And there isn't any unifying driving force saying, we like this, we don't like that. But Romanesque really is the end of regionalistic, basically, variation. And when Gothic takes off, and when it subsequently turns into the international Gothic, it's so desirable that it basically smashes the hell out of any regional personal preference. So that's one of the reasons why Gothic is huge.
And that's actually very interesting, because I always assumed it to be more of a geographical distinction, like you said, where certain areas just did certain things differently. But what you described is almost as if there's a competition for what would be the dominating art force to come out forward of that. Would you say it's a good blend of geography and a cultural competition, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I think.
And I'm not sure. My apologies. I'm not sure competition is a correct word, but almost like what is going to be the domineering force of what is our society is usually expressed through art. And I'm curious, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that it's a great question, and you can almost look at Amadeus, that extraordinary, extraordinary film about Mozart and Salieri. We have to remember that what is desirable and fashionable in art is in the hands of people who are paying for it and want it. And it's a little bit like, can you remember growing up as kids, you know, we all had candy bar phones, as they were called, and then we all wanted flip phones. And, you know, the shift between wanting a candy bar phone and a flip phone is depending on whether a cool kid, whatever the cool kid has, and patronage and what is celebrated is a huge part in how these things move forward. And especially when you start looking particularly at the international Gothic style and the Italo-Byzantine style moving, which is kind of, it gets very complicated because it is still kind of influenced by the Romanesque, but at the same, there's a huge area of debate. It's not a settled question as to how all these influences knit together. But what you do find eventually is you find wealthy powerhouses, wealthy patrons, eventually papal patrons, or you know, the families of popes saying, I want somebody who can depict Jesus looking like that. That looks more like a real person to me. I want whoever wants to depict it like that. That's what I want. And if the Pope has that, then everybody else has to have that because it's fashionable. It's the same thing as Vogue, right? Nothing ever changes. There's nothing new under the sun.
I like how you framed that. And I'm glad you mentioned that, especially with Christ. And for people who don't know, and Will, I'm sure, could speak way more on this than I can, but during the medieval era was, I would argue, is where you see a lot of depictions of Jesus Christ show up. And that's something I always found very unique, how he was always the focus of, like, you know, what is like pinnacle art, if you will, at that time would be our Lord. And I'm curious along with that as well, something I wanted to know with this factor, but do you think any of the symbolism of this era, such as when I was doing research, a very common one that came up was a gold leaf? Do you think that has something similar to do with our depiction of Christ, or is that a separate thing? Because, like you said at the beginning of the podcast, symbolism is very heavy in this era of art.
Sorry, just to be clear, Solid, were you talking about gold leaf?
Yes, I'm curious if there's a correlation in symbolism between the depictions of gold leaves, because that's a very common thing I saw when researching this episode, and depictions of Jesus Christ. Is there anything that's synopsis with like a divine, or is it a different interpretation of what that meant?
So, as a Catholic, I subscribe to one perspective. As an art historian, I'm mindful of mentioning that the old principles of scarcity play a huge role in the development of pigment and palette for the depiction of religious art in the Middle Ages. For example, gold is easy to come by. Gold you can hammer down. You know, at this point in time, we're talking about ducats or florins, which are made of, you know, gold. Or we're still in get your tinfoil hats on, boys. We're talking about bimetallic currency for when the end comes.
There's the impersonation. Let's go.
Gotta get your shelters ready for when the apocalypse comes. But so I probably alienated half of your viewership just by saying that right there. So you can shoot me later.
No, I love it. Keep it up. I love it. Let's go.
So gold is easy to come by in this period of time. There is a reason why the Blessed Virgin Mary is depicted in blue, and there are long-standing traditions to do with the color blue, but blue, ultramarine blue, as it's called, azurite lapis lazuli blue, was made from stones, lapis lazuli, ground up stones which were carried over from Afghanistan. The ultramarine, that is why they're called ultramarine, because they came from over the sea. This is why this is the most precious color, that azurite blue that we see so often applied to the robes and clothing of the Blessed Virgin Mary, more precious than gold. You know, every person had a gold coin that they could hammer down. Literally, that is all gold leaf is. It's a coin that's been smashed into like a millimeters, like less than a millimeter. Azurite blue, completely different question. That was the ultramarine lap, made from the finest of the fine. So there is always, and we see this because we're talking in the Christian context, going back to the construction of the Ark of the Covenant. You give your best to God. The Ark of the Covenant has the most extraordinarily specific instructions as to there can be no sound made and your feet have to be wrapped in burlap and this and that and I'm not belittling it at all, praise God. But I think that we can answer that question simply by saying that people who loved God wanted to give the best to God. I don't think that there was any overarching agenda. It was quite simply, this is the image of everything that we hold dear. This is the image of the story and history of our salvation. We will apply to it the best that we have to offer to indicate. Which is interesting because historically in Byzantine art and in Eastern icons, they use something, and we do see this a little bit in the beginning of the Tuscan Renaissance. They use something called hierarchical scale, which is to say you'll see the Blessed Virgin Mary, but like, you know, at the end of the Power Rangers, you know, when they defeated the enemy and they'd rip off that little thing from their shoulder and they'd turn into that giant thing, you know, they would depict the Blessed Virgin Mary or Christ 10 times the size of everybody else there present. And then as Italy becomes wealthy, as Italy becomes, especially with papal families and with the rise of the mercantile classes, and they have access to, they've got money to burn, instead of burning it, instead of making Our Lady look ridiculously huge or Christ looking ridiculously huge, they apply it to images of the figures of the history of their salvation. It's a simple solution. Let's not get Da Vinci Code about this.
When you mentioned them making Our Lady look ridiculously huge or Christ looking huge, are we talking about like swole here, like big muscles, or? I'm sorry, I'm kidding. It's had to throw that in there.
So there are a million one things that I could say to that, but given that we're talking about Our Lady, it would be deeply inappropriate for me to make comments about you and your muscle mummies.
No. Yeah, no, bless our Holy Mother. She's amazing. But something I've been thinking about as well, and you already established earlier that the medieval era is very human focused, but there are times I notice animals in some depictions or paintings, and I wanted to know, for this era, were there any animals that were deeply symbolic or common in any paintings at all? Whether it be a wolf or a dog or a bat or a cat, anything like that you believe was like a recurring theme? And if it's a yes to that, what would these things be?
Yeah, so it is important to recognize as well that one of the things that I'm a huge fan of is especially looking at the Florentine Academy. Well, it's not really an academy yet, but certainly the Florentine late medieval proto-Renaissance. They're called the Italian primitives. That's a nice way of putting them. They're deeply sophisticated, well-read artists, but at the same time they realize that a lot of the people who are looking at their work probably can't read in some instances, not all. We mustn't, like, I'm very tired of this overemphasis of, well, nobody in the Middle Ages could read, because that is overdone a million times over. But yes, you find that in many of the handbooks that they used for their iconographies, like in the Legenda Aurelia, the Golden Legend, written by Jacobus de Vorain, Dominican, and also in a whole host of other handbooks, but especially in the Legenda Aurelia, there are certain animals like peacock and dog that have ascribed to them certain meaning. One of my favorites is the pelican, Pie Jesu Pelicane, the pelican who rips open her own breast to feed her young. So there are a whole host of symbolic meanings, but what we find towards the end of the Middle Ages is that they're trying to kind of suppress and change some of these symbolic meanings to stop them from being, you know, kind of like crypto Illuminati-esque Dan Brown symbols into, oh gosh, yeah, you know, in the same way that we would say that, I don't know, I can't think of a good example, but in the same way that we would say that snakes represent evil, and if you see a snake in a painting, then it's probably something dubious, whereas if you see a Labrador, then it's probably something good. But prior to that, yes, there was this whole buying into this allegorical, didactic, symbolical world of meaning and painting and all of this kind of stuff. And we're on the cusp in this period that we're talking about of recognizing that those things are still useful. For example, peacocks, very famously, it was said by the Romans, and this is something that the Christians inherited, that peacock flesh didn't rot after it had died. Of course it did, but it took far longer. It was symbolic of Christ, and also it had all of these eyes on its feathers. All of these things are true. So it depends on which dimension of art history you're talking about, because they're all true, and they're also all irrelevant in a way.
No, thank you on that. And that makes a lot more sense. But going over to a topic that I'm also interested that ties into the medieval period was, what effect did the Crusades have in regards to art at all, if any?
Well, a lot and a lot. The Crusades changed everything. That's a little bit like saying, guys, come on, remember, 9/11 changed everything. You know, but it did. But they did, and I remember Mr. Bernard of Clairvaux preached the Second Crusade at Vézelay in something like 1135. History experts, I'm speaking off the top of my head if I got that wrong, please, rotten tomatoes are available in the gift shop. But the role of the Crusades, I think, expanded the well, first of all, it was important from a material perspective because it was through the opening of trade routes that some of these extraordinary resources and materials were available to be used. For example, like lapis lazuli, would have been brought home by successful crusaders from Asia Minor. The implications of the Crusades on art in this period of time are significant. It's not something that I can speak to tremendously because I think that they have particularly important consequences for certain kinds of iconographies in certain regions, certain families. I'm thinking of one place in particular, Pisa, Camposanto Monumentale, which is just a burial ground just on the same site as the Leaning Tower of Pisa, built using soil from the Holy Land. But in terms of iconography, in terms of the implications that it had for, as far as my work and my research is concerned, I acknowledge that it's there, but it's not something that I can say too much about. There are other forces at this period in time that are far more significant. For example, heresy, like the Catharist heresy in this time period, that are more important than the Crusades.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? I'm interested to hear. How is that more important?
Well, so this is unrepentantly my bailiwick, and it's in no small way. Certainly in Florence, Christian orthodoxy was saved through a fairly radical shift of depicting Christ suffering on the cross, the Christus Patiens. And we were quite late in doing this in the West. At the time of the iconoclast heresy in the whole Damascus Severus incident in the 8th and also into the 9th centuries, depending on how you look at it, in the East, there were suggestions and discussions that Christ was not a human person, or that he was a phantom, or that if he were a human person, or if he had two unnatures which were indivisible according to Chalcedon, that he didn't feel pain, he couldn't suffer, and so on. And the Dominicans, under a great weight of difficulty, decided to pioneer some of the extraordinary work of Giotto and Cimabue, Giotto especially, in depicting Christ as a man who was suffering, capable of suffering, bloated stomach, green skin, dying on the cross, because contemporary to them, there was this reemergence of Gnostic heresy, of a kind of reformulation of Manichaeism under the form of Catharism, which was just like rife, and in no small way, shape, or form, devotion to Our Lady and also depicting Christ as one who was capable of dying and suffering, as Giotto did for the Franciscans and the Dominicans, was instrumental. I honestly would say that we wouldn't even be having this conversation were it not for art. I think that the whole of Christendom would have fallen apart without the contributions of people like Giotto in defending the faith. in the 13th century.
I love how you put that, because when people think of defending the faith, they think of individuals who are intellectual powerhouses like the Aquinas, or people who are martyrs of the church. But to defend and keep alive the church, it's so multifaceted, where I believe, truly it is God's calling for all of us and their own individual goals that he wants for us. And I believe all of that leads to the same road of bringing glory to God. But that's really beautifully said.
I just want to read something from an article of mine, which
Yes, go ahead.
Specifically on this point. It was through the blessed Giovanni di Salerno, among the first of the Dominicans and his companions who were sent to Florence by St. Dominic, that new systems of militant piety were established to the veneration of the Blessed Virgin Mary, by means of which the Dominicans held that the heresy of Catharism could be defeated. Indeed, it was the company of the Laudi at Santa Maria Novella who in 1285 commissioned Duccio to produce his Maestà for the church. The significance of this is obvious as a visual affirmation of the Incarnation, and indeed one among the Laudi, a certain Ricuccio del Fulpuccio, made a specific bequest in his will to forever ensure that Giotto's crucifix of the suffering Christ dying on the cross and the Maestà of the Mother of our Lord, enthroned with her Son, were perpetually illuminated by candlelight. Within the pious visual culture of Santa Maria Novella, the paintings were clearly understood to be two subjects of the same movement forever and ever.
That was very beautiful reading that and hearing that. Thank you for sharing. I have one last question for you, and then we're going to be going into some Q&A. Or is that all good for you?
To the posto.
Oh, nice. So, one of my final questions is, as of recent, how has archaeological discoverings or research changed our understanding of medieval art history? Has there been any recent big breakthroughs or something that you'd love to share?
Well, I do have to say that when I was an undergraduate in Florence, I had the most extraordinary joy of witnessing the exact moment at which a panel crucifix in the church Ognissanti in Florence was conclusively proven to have been by Giotto. It was an extraordinary moment. Like, Giotto's he's a major artist for very few moments when especially the world of today, we're opening up, we're branching out. But it was extraordinary to have been there, and for one of my supervisors, for one of my lecturers, to have been Anna Marie Hilling, to have been instrumental through the work of the Opificio della Petteredure, part of the verification process. So we're still seeing extraordinary. The Middle Ages, it sounds like it's all done and settled, but we're still coming up with extraordinary questions, and we still have a lot to learn, and there's still a lot of questions. But yeah, that to me was a pretty cool moment of discovery to have been part of. Well, not part. I wasn't part of it, but you know what I mean. To have seen that happen.
Oh, definitely. And a quick follow-up question for that, because I'm curious. But what are some preservation challenges faced by medieval art, and has there been any way that modern technology aids us in its conservation?
Well, conservation is an interesting thing, and the Courtauld Institute in London, it's a really kind of, for example, I can't paint, I can't even draw, I can barely even write my own name most days, let alone draw anything. But there are extraordinary programs for people who are skilled in painting, and also skilled art historians. And there are techniques that have been used for a very long time for restoring paintings. So, for example, there was a very famous couple of really bad floods in Florence, which have majorly damaged enormously significant works of art. One of them is one of these panel crucifixes by Cimabue. And I have to say that the art historical communities still work on a very old-fashioned basis, which is that when it is deemed prudent to restore a work of art, they do so using something called cross-hatching. So they will repaint and restore if it's deemed necessary, but using a technique which is detectable under close observation, which will indicate that it has been restored, but to the naked eye, it can't be, because it's really important that we indicate what is original and what isn't. More broadly at the moment, looking at certain architectural landmarks and landscapes and things like this, I'm I'm quite in favor of letting what's been blown up stay blown up. Unfortunately, we should be working harder to make sure that it doesn't get blown up in the first place. But in the case of painting, if it's going to be useful, there are all sorts of techniques that mean for posterity, let's say that if we were wiped out for 5,000 years or something, in 5,000 years, archaeologists will be able to look at it and say, this is original and this is not, this has been restored. And I'm really glad that those techniques exist.
Definitely. And before we go into the Q&A, I just want to say one more time, thank you so much for being on our show. It's amazing to have you with us here. And I'm glad I had a chance to speak with you and discuss this topic, because I love art a lot and it's something I'm passionate about and I always want to learn more of, same as philosophy and theology. And that's one of the things I enjoy about having a podcast, is being able to speak to intellectual people like you on this subject.
Not at all. I'm honestly, it's an honor to be here, so it really is.
Thank you. So going through our Q&A, we have some questions from individuals who would like their names read and some who would like to remain private. So we're going to start with questions of the names and then we're going to go into the private ones. But first question is from Christian M. He wants to ask you, he says, hello, Will. Why did the medieval art lose perspective, as in why are a lot of drawings so flat? I also want to know, why did they draw cats and other animals walking on their hind legs all the time?
What was the first part?
The first part he wanted to know is, why did the medieval art lose perspective compared to the original, as in it's like very flat drawings? And the second one was, why do they depict cats or other animals walking on their hind legs all the time?
Okay. So I presume that when the question is why are they flat? Is that right?
He used the word flat, and he says lose perspective, or other words, why so flat?
Right. So I mean, this is an interesting question, because we actually don't have, until we discovered Pompeii and Herculaneum, we didn't really know what Greek or Roman painting looked like, because of course you remember that most paintings, unless they're on walls, in which case they're likely to be blown up, are going to be on pieces of wood. And wood, when we have paintings from the 12th century which are literally hanging on by a thread in extraordinary museums, we don't really know what Greek or Roman painting looked like writ large, or we didn't until we found Pompeii and Herculaneum. There is the simplest answer to that is because there's a kind of component of education and awareness that goes into being able to depict a two-dimensional image as if it exists in three-dimensional space. And even among some of the most extraordinary painters of the later medieval years, they do not do this. There are two main examples which are used in Art History 101. You have Duccios's Maestà versus Giotto's Maestà, and they're both painted within basically a handful of years of each other. One of them, the Blessed Virgin is surrounded on her throne with the Christ child on her lap, and angels and saints, and the angels look like they're stacked on top of each other. And then when you get to later depictions, you have perspective. Perspective is a very difficult thing to do, and involves a kind of empirical awareness as to how to go about doing it, which is like, you know, you can anybody can change a light bulb, but can you rewire an entire house? No, that takes a bit of time, education, input, and there's a bit of a continuum in making that possible. So in the absence of that knowledge, in the absence of that not lost knowledge, they still wanted to make these extraordinary images, but they just were not either weren't interested, this is important to say as a possibility, or did not know how to represent painted image or painted subject which is like as though it existed in three-dimensional space.
Okay. And I know for the predominant amount of this podcast, we were discussing Europe for the medieval, but he does have one more question in regards to Islamic medieval art. If any of these questions coming forward you don't know the answer to, it's completely okay. So you just aren't familiar with that. But he wanted to know, was Islamic medieval art inspired by Chinese art? If not, what explains the similarity in style, such as faces, eyes, proportion, perspective, etc.?
So on that, again, if I would be really, I would be seriously honestly interested, and I'd be willing to pick up on some of these questions in writing afterwards if anybody is interested, because I do have, with footnotes and references, some of these ideas aren't my own, and some of these I can't do justice off the top of my head. I'm not an Islamicist nor an Orientalist. However, you find that certain aspects of physiognomy are shared. These kind of almond-shaped eyes, the old archaic smile, because there was an extraordinary amount of trade and interaction between the Levant and the East, and then that subsequently filters into Europe at a later point in time. I do have an answer to that, but it requires a huge amount of groundwork to get into it. Suffice it to say that there are extraordinary examples of Greco-Buddhist art called Gandhara, which are indicative of the fact you will find the Buddha depicted as a Greek god in the Hellenistic era. We must not forget that at the time of Alexander the Great, the expanse of the ancient world was colossal, going up to the fringes of Persia and perhaps at various points in time a little bit beyond, not officially. But I can't do justice to that question right here, right now. Suffice it to say that there was enormous cultural contact between various powers in the ancient world.
I sent you as well some of these questions on Twitter if you want to check that really quick while we go through them, if that would help, like visually seeing some of these questions. But if there's a question that's already been asked, I'm not going to read that one because we already covered it in the podcast. But that's for Christian. So next we have Rose Hood. He asked, by any chance, do you know of an obscure artist called Prosper Laponi, more recent than medieval? And he also wants to know, who is your favorite medieval artist or favorite geographical region of art history?
Apropos Prosper Liponoi, that is way. I think
if I use my good name too, I haven't seen a name before.
Prosper Liponoi, I think, is like a very nearly like middle of the 19th century. So I can't say too much about that. However, I have seen a catalogue raison for this particular artist. And I do abide by this very solid principle of, if you don't have anything sensible to say, then shut up. But yeah, very fine artist from what I've said. If only other people, Sol is laughing as I'm saying this right now because he agrees with me, and he is saying this to nobody in particular, but if you don't have anything interesting to say, shut up, X. So what was the second half of that question?
My apologies. The second part of the question was, let me get it real quick. That's threw me off. Who is your favorite medieval artist or favorite geographical region of art history?
Well, I have to say, I am partisan. I am a huge lover of the Florentine Renaissance. For me, I've spent 7 years thinking and writing about Giotto and the people associated with him. But then also you have weird, eccentric cases like Simone de Crocifisi, who nobody's ever heard of, who spent his life painting our Lord suffering on the crucifix. And so yeah, Tuscany, definitely. Giotto, definitely. But at the same time, I'm always excited by things that take me by surprise when I sit back and think, oh gosh, that's amazing. So I'm not an absolute supremacist, but I have to stick with my old adoptive hometown of Florence on that one.
All right, I see. Hometown representing. Okay. Next question we got is from Lucas Roberts. He wants to know, is it true that medieval Christian art placed a very high emphasis on Jesus' suffering as opposed to his life and or resurrection?
I feel like Lucas is maybe put this question because he knows what I've spent my life doing. But it's very helpful. So yes, this is true, but it's not universally true. It's not true in the early Middle Ages. The crucifixion itself is quite a late, like even the cross is a late Christian symbol. But yes, certainly by the time that we get to the Renaissance of the 12th century, one of the unique and most extraordinary things that happens under the Dominicans and after Giunta Pisano and Cimabue and Giotto, we find an extraordinary renaissance of devotion to the humanity of Christ. And it's in that context that St. Francis and St. Dominic emerged. They were nourished by these artistic depictions of a Christ who could suffer.
All right, thank you. Next, we have, one of our sponsors and the recent episode we just done, Black Monk Rosaries. They want to know, what are some innovations/techniques taken from the East and Islam that were used in Western art and architecture? And, excuse me if I mispronounce this word, but he also wants to know your favorite Tiffinum, if I believe I'm saying correctly. Yes.
Yes, so, I mean, it's an interesting question in terms of technique and technicality, because of course Albert Suger is credited as, from an architectural history perspective, as inventing Gothic architecture, but even the Gothic arch itself is already extant in the Islamic world, and it of course subsequently entered into the I'm trying to sound as unponcy as I can, which is very difficult with a voice like this. But had then entered into the Burgundian vernacular. But yes, certainly there are a whole lot of structural techniques that were not so much necessarily artistic, but certainly architectural techniques which entered into the Gothic architectural, like late Romanesque and Gothic architectural vocabulary via the Islamic masters. My favorite tympanum is from the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Gilles, and I will post a link if anybody wants to see it later.
Amazing, nice. And I get what you're saying, Will, about the voice thing, but for me, it's my physical looks. I can't help looking like a Greek god. It's a struggle, but that's a different subject, though. You know, it's not easy being this beautiful, but
it has to, Sola. Your reward will be in heaven.
Oh yeah. So we have a question here from Tim. He wants to know, what are some of the best books a person interested in learning more about medieval art history could read? So do you have any book recommendations?
You know, I have to say there's an extraordinary book and there's an extraordinary series, which was one of the first things that I wanted to be. I was originally supposed to go off to Cambridge to be a classicist and study Latin and Greek language.